night the idea arrived, it felt more like an accident than a revelation. Arthur Hale was not the sort of man who expected lightning to strike twice. He was a quiet, slightly hunched scientist with a permanent smudge of oil on his left thumb and a childhood habit of chewing the end of his pencil when he thought hard. He worked at a small experimental unit on the edge of a blown-out airfield, the kind of place where half the hangars smelled of paraffin and the other half smelled of old fuel and tired jokes. Everyone called him Hale because it sounded sturdier than Arthur, and because he kept his hair short and his temper shorter. For months the night skies over. Britain had become a different kind of battlefield. German bombers came in waves, black shapes against a skyboard of cloud. The city lights were snuffed out every evening. The blackout turned towns into glassy black pools. Searchlights swept like lighthouses gone mad, catching anything that moved and painting it silver for a heartbeat before it vanished again. The night fighters, the brave pilots who climbed into fragile planes to meet the Germans in darkness, were a ragged kind of hero. They fought on instruments and instinct, and sometimes they fought with luck so thin you could slice it with a razor. Arthur, who loved physics the way other men loved cigars, had spent the last 2 years trying to make something that would give those pilots better odds. He hated the idea of machines being cleverer than people, but he loved the way light behaved, how it could be guided and tricked if you knew its moods. The German bombers relied on sight as much as on radar. They looked for silhouettes, for the telltale shine of an aircraft as searchlights swung by. If you could hide the shine, if you could take the bright blackness and fold it into something else, you might make a plane vanish from a bomber crew's eye. Notion of using mirrors came to him in the middle of a minor disaster. He'd been fixing a cracked focusing mirror that belonged to a local telescope club. The mirror was cheap and old, and when he put it in the sunlight it threw a bright, neat patch of glare on the hangar wall. For a second, the glare made the hangar look like day, like somebody had stolen the sun and set it inside a barn. Arthur laughed, because it was a stupid and beautiful thing, and laughed harder when his assistant, a young woman named Elsie who was good with soda and better with ideas, suggested they pointed the mirror at the airfield. It would blind them, she said, and her voice had that sharpness that turned small thoughts into dangerous ones. They started small, a single polished panel clamped to the side of a bowfighter in the workshop, angled so it caught the searchlight and returned the light away from the bomber lines. The first trial was a mess. The panel shook violently. The pilot complained of sun in his eyes while flying at 2,000 feet in pitch dark, and the panel shattered before they even made it back. But during those chaotic 30 seconds, the pilot had a clear sighting. A bomber that might have been seen by the searchlights had vanished for a heartbeat as the mirror flashed. That tiny disappearance lodged in Arthur like a splinter. He became stubborn the way some men become brave. He and Elsie worked nights, not because of the blackout, but because the quieter hours let them think. They learned to roughen the surface of the mirror in tiny patterns, to mosaic it so that light would scatter rather than return in a single blinding beam. They learned that a chaotic reflection was safer, instead of one bright glare that could point to a plane. A broken-up reflection drowned the bomber crew's eyes with false signals. When the aircrew looked up, they saw light where there was none. They saw movement that wasn't there, and the actual fighter could slip through that confusion. Word leaked, as everything does when men live close and worry more than they sleep. A flight sergeant came by with a cup of tea that was mostly encouragement and a little suspicion. "You can't make something invisible," he said, which was both right and useless. The Air Ministry was more cynical. Papers, signatures, and polite refusals piled up faster than they would have if Arthur had tried to sell candy. Nobody liked the idea of trust placed in a few polished bits of metal. They liked things they could put a number on. Speed, altitude, fuel load. Mirrors were woolly. They smelled like superstition. That, more than anything, wounded Arthur tight. He had spent his life being told no. Science taught you that no sometimes meant not yet, and sometimes meant you're looking at it the wrong way. So he kept going. He built a small ring of mirrors, not one panel, but a cluster that could be mounted beneath a fighter's fuselage. The mirrors were angled to catch the hunter's light and scatter it into a harmless, dazzle-like aura. In the hangar, under the flat yellow light, it looked like a cheap sculpture. In the sky, when they tested it with a searchlight as a stand-in for the enemy, it worked. The first real trial was at age-old midnight, the sort of time when the voices of the base were half asleep and half the engines roar. Arthur couldn't be on the plane. Regulations and a sensible fear of authority kept him grounded. He stood on the grass with Elsie and a handful of technicians, wrapped in coats that smelled of oil. They watched the fighter take the light and, for a single sickening and thrilling moment, disappear from where the searchlight had been expecting it. No one celebrated. There was relief, a small one, like the feeling when you find a hand in the dark that you thought you'd lost. But there was also a quiet, darker thing, the realization that invisibility was a weapon and weapons change people. Elsie, who had joined because she loved making and fixing things, asked in a voice that didn't try to hide its worry, "What if they make the same trick work for the other side?" Arthur wanted to say it wouldn't happen, that the English would never use it for anything but defense. He wanted to believe that the trick would save lives and that save was simple, but the war had taught him otherwise. Decisions were made for reasons beyond science: pride, fear, a stubborn need for answers. He felt the weight of that, which is how most inventions begin to be both blessing and curse. That night, as they filed back to the huts with the taste of cold metal in their mouths, Arthur looked up at the sky. The cloud bank was low, thick as wool, and nowhere in it did he see the pattern of stars he used to map his childhood. Somewhere over that blanket, German bombers kept coming. Somewhere under it, airmen who could no longer see the city lights were waiting. Arthur held his hands in his pockets, feeling, for the first time, how fragile a trick of light could be under the brutality of war. He had made a thing that could hide people. He had not yet decided whether hiding them was the same as saving them. The following days blurred together in a rhythm of exhaustion and quiet obsession. The base never truly slept. Engines rumbled in the dark, and somewhere across the field, mechanics sang tuneless songs just to stay awake. Arthur barely noticed the world outside the hangar anymore. He ate when Elsie shoved a sandwich into his hand and slept in stolen half-hours on the office cot, surrounded by notes, broken glass, and equations scribbled on the walls like prayers. The first successful trial had shaken everyone. Officially, the report described it as an anomaly in light reflection. Unofficially, the pilots called it the ghost skin. To Arthur, that name was both thrilling and unsettling. He'd spent his career trying to make things visible, to measure, to reveal, to explain. Now he was doing the opposite, bending light until men vanished inside it. It was beautiful in a dreadful sort of way. The military, of course, took notice. Within a week, a black car arrived at the airfield, carrying two men who looked like they'd never smiled in their lives. Their coats were long, their shoes too clean for mud. They spoke in the clipped, cold tone of London officers, men who thought in reports, not risks. They asked Arthur to explain his mirror system, and when he started describing the physics of diffuse reflection, one of them interrupted. "We don't need the theory, Mr. Hale, we need to know if it works." Arthur swallowed his irritation. "It works," he said quietly, "but it's unpredictable. Light behaves like a living thing. It changes depending on the angle, the atmosphere, the time of night. It's not perfect." The taller man smiled without warmth. "Perfection isn't required, Doctor. Advantages." Elsie caught the exchange from behind the workbench, her jaw tightening. She hated these types, the ones who saw inventions as weapons first and ideas second. When the officers left, she muttered, "They'll take it from us, Arthur, twist it into something you won't recognize." He didn't answer. He couldn't, because part of him already knew she was right. A week later, the ministry sent orders to fighters were to be equipped with the mirror system for operational testing. Arthur and Elsie were given clearance badges and a promise that if the test succeeded, funding would come. That word, funding, had the weight of oxygen. It could keep the project alive. And so, despite his unease, Arthur agreed. The first mission was set for the following moonless night. The pilots chosen were veterans, men who had seen too much and spoken too little. One was Captain Reeve, broad-shouldered and superstitious, who always carried a small St. Christopher medal in his glove pocket. The other was Lieutenant Danvers, younger, sharper, and far too confident for Arthur's liking. Arthur and Elsie spent 2 days fitting the panels, small, curved segments of polished metal arranged under the fuselage and wings, like scales on a serpent. Each one had been angled by hand, tested under floodlight, and adjusted with microscopic care. The goal was to scatter light in all directions except toward the observer. To the naked eye, the planes looked like patchwork machines stitched from broken glass. When dusk fell, the hangar lights dimmed. The planes rolled out onto the tarmac like creatures preparing to slip into another world. Arthur stood near the edge of the runway, his breath misting in the cold. The engines roared to life, rattling through his bones. He tried to believe this was progress, that he was saving lives, not tempting ghosts. As the fighters climbed into the night, the searchlights tracked upward. Arthur shielded his eyes. Then something strange happened, something both terrifying and magnificent. The first fighter passed directly through a beam, and for a brief moment, it disappeared. The light bent, fragmented, shimmered, and then the plane was simply gone. Elsie gasped softly beside him. "It's working," she whispered. The second fighter followed, but the effect was weaker, uneven, like a reflection that didn't quite match its source. Still, both aircraft vanished into the thick dark. The ground crew cheered. The officers exchanged knowing looks, and Arthur just stood there, frozen, because beneath the awe was something colder, fear. Hours passed. The mission was to intercept a small German bombing formation returning over the channel. Radio chatter was minimal. Arthur sat by the console, headphones pressed to his ears, listening to static that hissed like rain. Then, a crackle Reeves' voice, tight with adrenaline. "Command, this is Ghost One. They can't see us. I repeat, they can't bloody see us." The room erupted in cheers. Arthur felt his heart surge, but then came Danvers' voice, sharp and broken by interference. "Something's wrong, lights bouncing, can't orient." Reeves' static swallowed the rest. The signal died. Silence stretched. Seconds became minutes. Someone cursed under their breath. Then the radar operator spoke quietly, almost to himself. "One of them's gone off course, descending fast." Arthur's stomach sank. Elsie's hand found his, cold and trembling. Outside, the night was quiet again, too quiet. When dawn came, only one fighter returned. Captain Reeve landed with his plane half-torn and his face pale as ash. He couldn't explain what had happened, said he'd seen light where there shouldn't have been any, that the mirrors had turned the world inside out. Danvers never came back. Arthur stood beside the wrecked fighter, staring at the shards of polished metal still clinging to the hull. They looked like broken eyes staring back at him. In that silence, he realized what he had done, and that invisibility, once found, never stayed in the right hands for long. Asterisk. For 2 days after the failed mission, the airfield felt like a graveyard pretending to be alive. The hangar doors stayed half shut, as if the wind itself was afraid to look inside. Mechanics worked without speaking. Even their tools seemed quieter. Somewhere across the field, a single fighter engine occasionally coughed to life, only to die again. No one mentioned Lieutenant Danvers by name. Arthur barely slept. He stayed in the lab, surrounded by fragments of shattered mirrors that caught the lamplight and threw it back in cruel little flashes. Every reflection seemed to accuse him. He ran calculations until his eyes blurred, searching for a reason, any reason for what had gone wrong. Was it the angle, the curvature, the way light scattered at altitude? None of it explained how a man could vanish off radar and out of sight, not just from the enemy, but from the very world he belonged to. Elsie came in on the second night, carrying a tin of tea she hadn't touched. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale from exhaustion. She watched Arthur working and finally said, "You're trying to fix something that isn't broken, Arthur. The system worked, it just worked too well." He didn't look up. "That's not science. That's madness. Light doesn't work too well." "Tell that to the man who didn't come home," she said quietly. Her words hit him harder than he'd expected. He stopped writing. The pencil hovered over the page for a long moment, trembling. "Do you think I wanted this?" he said, voice low. "Do you think I wanted to build something that swallows people whole?" Elsie didn't answer. She just sat beside him, staring at the table covered in broken glass and equations. The mirrors reflected their faces in pieces distorted, scattered, like they'd both already begun to disappear. The next morning the officers returned. They brought with them a sealed folder and an order stamped confidential priority. One of them, a broad man with silver hair and eyes like granite, spoke without preamble. "The ministry is authorizing full development, Mr. Hale." The results were conclusive. Arthur blinked. "Conclusive. One man's dead." The officer didn't flinch. "Casualties happen in war. The mirror camouflage proved its value. The enemy couldn't track our aircraft, not visually, not by search. That's a strategic advantage we can't ignore." Arthur stepped forward, fury barely contained. "You don't understand what you're playing with. Light isn't predictable up there. A few degrees wrong, and the pilot loses all visual reference. He doesn't know which way is up. He doesn't see the horizon. You're not just hiding him from the enemy, you're hiding him from himself." The officer's gaze hardened. "You're a scientist, Mr. Hale, not a philosopher. Your job is to make it work, not to moralize about it." Elsie clenched her fists, but Arthur raised a hand to stop her. He understood now resistance would only make them push harder. If he refused, they'd replace him. If he stayed, maybe he could still control how the invention was used. So he nodded, slowly, and signed the papers. But inside, something cracked the small, stubborn piece of him that still believed science could exist without cruelty. Weeks passed. The project moved underground, literally. They relocated to a hidden facility near Reading, where the walls were thick and the windows were few. The tests grew bolder. They fitted larger aircraft with mirror panels, fine-tuning the reflections, experimenting with heterosystem coatings. They found ways to bend not just visible light, but radar signals too. Every success came at the cost of Arthur's peace. He noticed strange things during testing. The way pilots sometimes reported hearing faint whispers in their headsets when the mirrors were engaged, as if the static carried voices. Instruments would flicker and freeze. Occasionally, the reflection panels would pulse faintly, catching light that wasn't there. When Arthur mentioned it, the engineers laughed it off as voltage interference. But deep down, he felt something colder. One evening, after everyone had left, Arthur stood in the dark hangar and turned on one of the mirror panels by himself. The room filled with a trembling shimmer, not light exactly, but something that felt alive. The air grew colder. His own reflection fractured, multiplied, then seemed to step an inch out of sync with him. For half a second, he thought he saw himself blink after he had already done it. He stumbled back, switching the system off, heart pounding. The reflection vanished, but the echo of it, the sense that something had stayed behind, did not. When he told Elsie, she didn't laugh. She only said, "You know how glass works, Arthur. It doesn't just reflect light, it remembers it." That night, the wind outside howled across the empty field. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed, not for bombs this time, but for another test plane that had failed to return. The mirrors worked flawlessly, the report said. The pilot, however, had disappeared before the engine even hit the ground, and for the first time, Arthur Hale wondered if his invention wasn't hiding men from the enemy, but showing them to something else entirely. Asterisk. Arthur didn't tell anyone about the whispers. He couldn't. The officers were convinced they'd stumbled onto the perfect weapon, a way to make the night itself fight for Britain. The papers called it optical ghosting technology, but the airmen called it something else. The looking glass. It sounded poetic, but to Arthur, it sounded like a warning. Each new test took them deeper into territory that felt less like science and more like sorcery. The panels began to change in subtle ways. They no longer just scattered light, they absorbed it. Standing near an active set felt like being beside a hole in reality, a patch of air that swallowed warmth and sound. Pilots started refusing to fly with the mirrors, claiming the reflections showed things that weren't in the cockpit. One said he'd seen his own face in the glass, smiling back even when he wasn't. Arthur tried to shut the project down. He sent letters to the ministry, reports full of warnings, calculations that screamed danger. None were answered. Funding doubled. More planes arrived. One cold evening, Elsie burst into his quarters with a folder clutched to her chest. Her hands were shaking. "They're not testing over the channel anymore," she said. "They're sending them inland. Over London. They want to test the invisibility against friendly radar, see how close they can get to the city before they're spotted." Arthur froze. That's madness. What if they lose control? They could crash into civilian areas. Elsie's eyes were bright with anger. "Do you think they care? They want a weapon that can vanish." Arthur, not just from sight, from responsibility. He looked down at the folder at the stamped orders inside and knew what had to be done. For the first time since the war began, Arthur Hale decided to sabotage his own invention. That night, while the hangar slept and the guards smoked cigarettes by the gates, Arthur and Elsie crept inside. They moved quickly, working by the dim light of a single torch. Arthur went to the control array, unbolted the main regulator and began pulling wires. Elsie loosened the mirror mounts, cracking one deliberately. Then, suddenly, the sound of boots, voices. The officers were there, shouting. Arthur turned and saw the reflection panels ignite with a faint blue shimmer. The air thickened, humming like a living thing. The mirrors had activated themselves. The light twisted, not outward but inward. It bent the hangar, bent the night, bent the night. The reflections multiplied on every mirrored surface until there were hundreds of Arthur Hales and Elsie staring back, some moving a fraction too slow, some smiling when they shouldn't have been. Elsie's voice trembled. "Turn it off," he tried. The switch wouldn't respond. The machine had no power running to it anymore, and yet it was alive, drawing energy from somewhere else. The reflections shimmered, then began to step forward, peeling off the mirrors like figures stepping through water. Arthur screamed for her to run. She didn't. She turned, grabbed his arm, and together they smashed at the control panel. Sparks flew. The hum grew deafening. A flash of white light swallowed everything. When Arthur woke, it was morning. Smoke hung low in the hangar. The mirrors were gone, melted, or perhaps simply absent. The officers were there, shouting orders. Medics rushed in, but Elsie was nowhere. Her name wasn't even on the recovery list. The official report called it an explosion due to equipment malfunction. They buried the story under layers of secrecy. Arthur was discharged, given a medal, and told to forget everything. But he couldn't. He returned to his small cottage outside Cambridge and spent his days staring into ordinary mirrors, searching for something he couldn't name. Sometimes, when the light hit the glass just right, he swore he saw her standing behind him, half smiling, waiting. Other times, he saw the planes glimmering in the distance, half caught between reflection and reality. Years later, when the war ended, the ministry quietly decommissioned all mirror-based camouflage. The technology was locked away, labeled as unstable. The files disappeared into archives no one was supposed to open. But a few rumors lingered, reports of strange flashes in the night sky, of radar echoes shaped like forgotten British fighters, flying patterns no one had authorized. Arthur grew old, and people forgot his name. Yet in his final days, the nurses who tended him said he would often wake in the night, whispering to the darkness. It wasn't invisibility we found. It was the other side of seeing. On the evening he died, his bedside mirror cracked clean down the middle. No sound, no reason, just a silent fracture that split his reflection into two. And somewhere, far above the sleeping countryside, a faint shimmer crossed the sky, the ghost of a fighter gliding soundlessly through the clouds, still chasing a war that had long since ended. **